Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Muddy Mint. Today, we're going to be talking about water discounting. Now, this is a term that a lot of people get really confused about, and water in general is kind of a confusing part of soap making, how much to use, when to discount, all that kind of stuff, and especially for brand new soap makers. So stay tuned, and hopefully you'll enjoy this little video on water discounting. Okay, so for starters, what is a water discount? A water discount is when you use less water than normal in your soap. And so it's really very straightforward. Normally, you use a certain amount of water when you make your soap, and then a water discount is basically using less water than that. And the problem with this term, though, is that there is no normal amount of water to use in your soap. So when you are discounting, you have to know where you're discounting from. So if you have a certain amount of water that you typically use in your soap, and then you're using less for a different soap, then that's a water discount. And that could be a 10% discount, a 15% discount, something like that. And you'll often see websites referring to water discounts, but they don't actually ever really tell you what they're starting from. And just to illustrate this example even more, I have some notes here on my laptop where I went through a few different websites to figure out what kind of water amount they're using in their soap. And so the first one basically is what we use at Muddy Mint. We use a 2-to-1 water to lye ratio. So what that means is we use 2 parts water to 1 part lye. So if we have 5 ounces of lye, we use 10 ounces of water. So that's 2-to-1. Now, if you go look at a place like Soapcalc, you'll see that they refer to their water in a very different way. Their default measure, which a lot of people use, because a lot of people go into Soapcalc and it's their first time and they don't change the water amount because they basically just leave it the same, leave it at the default. The default in Soapcalc is 38% as a percentage of the oils. So this is a completely different measurement than how we do it because we refer to the amount of water we use relative to the lye amount. And in Soapcalc, the default is relative to the oil amount. So if you have 100 ounces of oil in your recipe, then you're using 38% or 38 ounces of water in that recipe. When I put in 100% olive oil soap into Soapcalc and I use their default 38% as a percent of the oils for the water amount, that came out to almost 3-to-1. So that means in that particular recipe, it's 3 times the amount of water compared to the amount of lye. And just as a reminder, we use 2-to-1. So that is quite a bit more water, and that's the default in Soapcalc. Now, I checked a few other websites to see what they use, and Brambleberry doesn't state exactly what they use, but I figured out that they use between 2.3 and 2.4, somewhere around that range, under 2.5 parts water to lye, so 2.5-to-1. And so that's much closer to what we use at Muddy Mint, but they don't really specify this anywhere. And when you go into their calculator, that part is kind of hidden from you, so you can't change the water amount in their calculator. As far as I know, I could be wrong about that because I don't use their calculator a ton. But unlike Soapcalc, where you can go in and make changes, Brambleberry has their water amount set by default. And so when you go in and it tells you, how much to use for your soap, it seems to be about 2.3 to 2.4-to-1 based on the lye amount. And so when they talk on their website about using a 10% discount, it's a 10% discount based on that amount. So as you're starting to see, there are a lot of different water amounts depending on where you look. I looked at the Sage, which is another lye calculator, and they actually offer a range of water amounts. So on their calculator, they basically say, use between this amount of water and this amount of water. And when you look at those amounts, it's 2-to-1 to 3-to-1 approximately. They also have it set up so that their super fat is kind of different options. And so they do it completely differently. I looked at Soapmaker Friend and they use 2-to-1 as the default. So they express their default by using water to lye ratio. However, they also have an option for water as a percent of oils, and that number is 38%. So they are using 2 to 1 as a default, but then if you switch it to water as percent of oils, they're using 38%, which is closer to 3 to 1. All right, hopefully this isn't confusing. My point here is that depending on what lye calculator you use, you're going to end up with a different water amount. In addition, depending on what recipe you look at, there's going to be a different water amount as well. And most recipes don't really tell you what that is. So unless you understand water in soap making and how it works, and then you can calculate it if you look at a recipe and kind of determine how much water is in there compared to what you want to use, you don't really know. And when I was a new soap maker, I had no idea about any of this stuff. I would go into Soap Calc and I just left it at the default, and that's how much water I used in all of my soaps. Or I would follow a recipe and I would just use whatever amount they suggested. And it was never really clear to me why you use water in soap, what the purpose of it is. And so we're going to go into that a little bit. So the purpose of water in soap, in my opinion, there's two purposes. The first one is to dissolve the lye. Now, remember that when you're making soap, it's a chemical reaction between lye and oils. And so water is actually not part of that equation. You need the water in order to dissolve the lye, because you can't just mix dry lye with your oils, because you need your lye to be mixed with water in order to dissolve it and get it in a liquid state. And then you can mix it with your oils and then you're all set. You get soap. So even though water isn't part of the chemical equation, you do still need it in order to dissolve your lye. And so that's the primary function of the water, is to be able to dissolve your lye. The secondary part of that equation is that you need water to help make your batter more fluid. Because if you only use enough to dissolve your lye, you may end up with thicker batter. And so what happens in a lot of beginner soap making recipes is that the water amount ends up being really high. And the reason for that is that it just creates a more fluid batter. It makes it easier to work with, and you don't end up with batter that's too thick. So it kind of sets you up for success, but at the same time, it results in some other problems. And those problems are that people have trouble unmolding because they're using too much water, especially when you're a beginner and you're using those soft-sided silicone molds. They're kind of rigid, and when you try to unmold your soap, you end up with pieces, corners coming off. And that happened to me a lot when I started making soap. And the solution for that a lot of people provide is to use sodium lactate. Sodium lactate is a liquid salt that helps harden your soap so that it's easier to unmold. But the reality is that you can resolve this issue just by using less water. And so using too much water when you're starting out, while it allows you to be able to have batter that you can handle more easily, it also creates softer soap that's harder to unmold. It also creates ash on top of your soap, often quite a bit of ash. People get glycerin rivers, and there's all kinds of issues that too much water can cause. Similarly, too little water can also cause issues, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Okay, so all this to say, there's no normal amount of water. There's actually only one known water amount, and that is the amount that you need to dissolve the lye. The minimum amount of water that you need to dissolve lye is 1 part water to 1 part lye. So if you have 5 ounces of lye in your recipe, you need 5 ounces of water to dissolve it. So that is the minimum amount, and there's no maximum, although if you use too much, it's going to be crazy. Some of the books I've seen will say to use 4 to 1 or 3 to 1, which is quite a lot of water, but you can technically use that much water and you'll end up with really fluid batter, but it will be a very soft soap, especially when you unmold. On top of that, it may take a longer amount of time to cure, because remember, the curing process is this process of evaporation of the water from your bar of soap. So the more water you use, the more water has to evaporate while the soap is curing. So that's another factor with water. So if there's no normal water amount, then how much water are you supposed to use? Now, I can tell you what we use at Muddy Mint. We use 2 to 1. And so we use 1 part water to 1 part lye just to dissolve the lye. And then we use another part of water or another liquid. which kind of brings us to the other issue and confusion with water in soap making. Water in soap making isn't always water. It can be any kind of liquid. It could be carrot juice, aloe vera juice, goat milk, and any other kind of milk. The water part of your soap can be anything. And so you can use water as a carrier for the lye. You can also use other liquids as a carrier for the lye. We always use water as the carrier for our lye, and we use the minimum amount of water that we need, which, as I said, is 1 to 1, 1 part water to 1 part lye. And then we use an additional liquid, typically goat milk, coconut milk, carrot juice, something like that, aloe vera juice, in order to make up the remainder of our water. So the way I think about it is there's kind of 2 parts to the water. There's the part that's required to dissolve the lye, which again is 1 part water to 1 part lye. So that's a 1 to 1 ratio. And then there's the remainder of the water that either adds properties based on the kind of liquid that you're adding to the soap, such as goat milk. And in addition to adding properties to the soap, it also makes your batter more fluid. So it's kind of a 2-for-1 there. Okay, so we've established there's no normal amount of water to use, but there is a minimum amount of water to use. So I like to think of things as going up rather than going down. So rather than a water discount, I kind of think of it as a water surplus. I've never heard anybody really talk about it this way, but if you need a minimum of 1 to 1, then anything you add on top of that is a surplus. But if you are creating a recipe or you're using a recipe somewhere and you are using the default amount of water that they suggest, first of all, I would figure out what that amount of water is relative to the lye. So if you go into Soap Calc, this is one of the soap calculators that I use the most, you'll see 3 different radio buttons. The first one is water as a percentage of oils, which is the default, and it's set to 38%. The next one is lye concentration, which you can also select. And then the next one is water to lye ratio. So lye concentration and water to lye ratio refer to the exact same thing. If you have 2 parts water, 1 part lye, that's a 33.333% lye concentration. That means that 1/3 of your solution, your overall solution, is lye. So those last 2 radio buttons are the ones that I would pick. I always use water to lye ratio. I don't actually know where this idea of water as percentage of oils came from, and there's probably some history there that's interesting, and it probably is a valuable measure. The thing is that, as I was playing in Soap Calc, I changed that number from 38% to 10%. And like you can put whatever number you want in there. And then it turned out there was actually less water than there was lye. And there was no warning or anything telling me that I shouldn't be doing that. So definitely be careful of that, because you always want to make sure you have at least the same amount of water as you have lye. That's the minimum. So back to our original question, what is a water discount? A water discount is kind of up to you, in my opinion. So we always use 2 to 1 water to lye ratio. So if we use a 10% water discount in our recipes, that would be 1.8 to 1. And we never refer to it as a 10% water discount. We always refer to it as, we're using a discount, we're going down to 1.8 to 1, or we're going down to 1.6 to 1. So the reason that term is really confusing is because you don't know what the baseline is, where you start at. It seems to me that in the soap making world, the baseline kind of used to be 3 to 1 as far as how much water you use compared to the lye. But it seems to have come down more and more as people realize how much trouble they're getting into with too much water, especially as we use more olive oil and liquid oils. And a lot of people who use a lot of butters and lard and tallow and those kinds of things probably need a little bit more water than people who are making soaps with more fluid and liquid oils. So that brings me to my last point. How do you know how much water to use? I would say start with 2 to 1, 2 parts water to 1 part lye. Start there, even as a brand new soap maker, and see how your recipe goes. I think that's a really good baseline to get a bar that's easy to unmold, but also is fluid enough of a batter. If you find that your batter is too thick when you do that, use a little bit more water next time. Bump it up to 2.2 to 1 or 2.4 to 1. and see how that goes. If you're finding that your batter is too fluid and you're having trouble unmolding, or you're getting a ton of soda ash and you don't want as much soda ash, then bump your water amount down. You can go down to 1.8 to 1, 1.6 to 1, and see how that works out for you. Now, I have a lot of people asking me about our recipes. Do you have any recipes that don't have goat milk, or do have goat milk, or don't use aloe vera? Because I don't have that on hand. So all of those alternative liquids, which is what I call them, you can use whatever liquid you want for that. You can just use water. So any part of the liquid part of your soap, it can be changed. So you can use less, you can use more, you can use a different liquid if you want. And so even though you get a recipe that has a high amount of water, or a recipe that has goat milk and maybe you don't want to use goat milk, you can just change that and use water instead. And you don't need to change anything in soap calc in order to accomplish that, because that is not part of the lye equation. It's not part of the chemical reaction that's happening in order to make soap. So the water can go up and down. You don't need to change anything in soap calc. You can use less water if you find that you're having trouble unmolding rather than using sodium lactate. You can use less water if you're having trouble with soda ash. If you are having trouble with your soaps gelling, you actually might want to use more water, because water helps with the gel process. A lot of people who use a very low water to lye ratio actually don't ever get gel. And so there are reasons to use more water and there's reasons to use less water. And one of the really big things is accelerating essential oils. If you're using an accelerating essential oil like clove and you're finding that your batch is seizing or getting thick really, really fast, the number one thing you can do to help with that is to add more water the next time you make that soap. And you'll see a huge difference in the workability of your batter. We can make pretty large batches of clove soap, and that's because we use more water in those soaps. So just something to keep in mind if you're having an issue with one of your soaps, whether you're getting glycerin reverse, soda ash, trouble unmolding, whatever the issue is, you can kind of make quite a few changes just by changing your water amount. So just give that a try and let me know how it goes in the comments. Hopefully that helped clarify water discounting. Just to recap, water discount is just using less water than normal. However, there is no normal, so that's confusing. Always use 1 part water to 1 part lye at minimum, at the very minimum. And if you're not sure where to start with 2 parts water to 1 part lye, 2 to 1. You can put that in the lye calculator as a 2 to 1 ratio. And then just go from there. Test out your recipe. This is what I did in my book. I always started every recipe as 2 to 1. And then some of them were really, really fluid and very, very soft. And so I changed the ratio of water the next time I made that soap. And so the final recipes in the book all have a water to lye ratio number in them. And I wish more soap making recipes would have those numbers in there, because it's just super valuable to know how much water you're using in your soap. And so if you're looking at a recipe and you don't know what the water amount is, you can calculate it. Just take the water amount, divide it by the lye amount, and then you can figure out how much water there is relative to the lye in that particular soap. All right, I hope this is helpful. This was a quick one. Hopefully it was quick. I tend to babble on and on sometimes, but if you have any additional questions, please leave them down below and I'll try to answer as much as I possibly can. We are going to do a few more videos on soap making terms in the future. So if there are any terms that you find confusing, definitely leave a comment down below and we'll try to do another video about this. All right, thank you so much. Have a great day. Bye.